It's a great pleasure to be here amongst so many friends, and of course to have the great pleasure of seeing the exhibition myself in its last couple of days. I was not able to travel over for the opening, so I've actually just had the experience of walking through the show this weekend, and I again would want to say to Helen and Vicky and all the colleagues here at the Fitzwilliam what a wonderful job they've done in re-envisioning this project. I did also want to say a couple of extra special thank yous to a couple of folks who are in the room. First of all, my former colleague Alan Graves, who's up from the Victoria and Albert Museum and is the Modern and Contemporary Ceramics curator there. Although, as Helen said, the exhibition is substantially identical, 90%, to the exhibition that was at Yale. Many of the most key changes are in fact loans from the Victoria and Albert Museum and also from the very fine collections at York, those two institutional lenders. So I did want to say thank you, Alan, for taking time out of your busy schedule and making it up here to Cambridge. And I also wanted to say an extra special big thank you to Mr. John Driscoll, here in the front row, great friend of ours at Yale, and the most significant individual lender to the exhibition. And many of his pots are again on view upstairs, and you can also see others that were included in the Yale presentation in the catalog, and also in the catalog you can see an interview that I conducted with John, in which he relates his experiences as a collector over many years and rather adventurous stories of sailing over here, flying over here in the 1970s, meeting Lucy Rhee, and other sort of war stories. So do talk to John about all of that if you have a chance. I promise you will not be disappointed. And with that, I now want to proceed on to my lecture, which is offered, I suppose, slightly in the spirit of a provocation, but also in the spirit of continuity with the exhibition itself. So I thought I would bring us back to this pot that Simon spoke about so eloquently earlier this afternoon, the moon jar, which in so many ways represents everything that we wanted to bring to the show and to extract from the history of British studio pottery, although it of course is in no way British, nor could it really be considered to be a studio pot. It's a historical vernacular pot, possibly used originally as a pickle jar or to store vinegar or something of that nature. What has, I think, kept us so fascinated with this form is that it is so multivariable in its interpretations, and so much can be made of it, as Simon was saying. And in particular, I've always been interested in the fact that both Leach, the great arch traditionalist of our story, and Lucy Rhee, the Viennese-born modernist, progressive of our story, were both able to see in this one object an image of themselves. So on the one hand, Leach found it to be a kind of anchor for his ideological preoccupations having to do with rootedness in the past. On the other, Lucy Rhee was able to look at this self-same object and understand it perhaps as a proposition about abstraction, as a, obviously a kind of pure white object, something that she could identify with in that sense, and in that sense possibly a screen of sorts, almost like a film screen, that she could see herself in, and therefore it's perhaps somewhat appropriate that you're seeing it here, even more milky and vague than it would be in person in our beautifully sunlit gallery during this presentation. So an incredible presence that is also in a funny way a kind of absence, and therefore I think a fitting exemplar of how difficult it can be to fix the meaning and importance of any one ceramic object, much less the entire history of a ceramic movement, which is what we've tried to do. And so when you come to the exhibition and are presented with this series of moon jars that range from the very traditional, although certainly expressive, and in fact perhaps even directly informed by abstract expressionism, the work of Akiko Hirai here, to the work of Nao Matsunaga, who's already been mentioned, and contributed this sort of postmodern deconstructivist non-moon jar to our moon jar section. And here I would be remiss not to mention that Nao, of course, studied with Alison at the Royal College of Art, and presumably learned a few tricks from her while there. We can understand these pots, or sculptures, whatever we would call them, as being in some way consciously within a tradition, in some ways consciously as receiving the collected material intelligence and artistic proposals of the past. And that, I think, is really how we presented them in the exhibition. We understand them in the exhibition as somehow reflecting back on the procession of ceramic objects that have led up to them. And indeed, one of the reasons that we chose the moon as our opening gesture was that the moon itself comes in phases, it cycles, it's something that we pass through and underneath and are illuminated by again and again and again, and it's something that we measure our lives by, if you will, night after night. And in the same way, a ceramic object is something that we might encounter every morning. Perhaps you have a favorite bowl or a favorite teacup. It's something by which you actually mark out the procession of your hours and days, months, and years of your life. And so we wanted to get that idea of temporality into the exhibition right at the forefront. But as I say, it was a very retrospective kind of temporality. How have we gotten to here? But of course, what I'm meant to be speaking about today is what is going to happen next. Tanya spoke of the crystal ball that, of course, I don't have. But I suppose I'm presenting myself to you today in the form of at least somebody who's opinionated about what should happen. And somebody with a few thoughts about what actually might happen. So let's perhaps understand these objects not so much as representatives of the present, but let's understand them perhaps as votes for the future, suggestions as to directions, places we might go, ideas that we might pursue further. So for example, you might understand Akiko Harai's moon jar as a vote to keep your nerve, to hold fast to tradition, to vary from it, and thereby achieve a kind of contemporaneity, but a contemporaneity that is really down to individuality. So the fact that these are her marks, the specific experience and condition that is arrived at through her studio practice and her kiln, that is the only claim about the now that is made by this pot. And in a way, I think what Harai is communicating, at least to me, when I look at these pots, which indeed are among some of the most beloved in the exhibition to judge from people's experiences as they've commented to me while they walk through, she's really saying, I am making pots that are relevant for now in exactly the same way that the moon jar was relevant in the 17th century, a satisfying form that simply speaks to you in an almost brute material sense. Nothing about technology, nothing about contemporary politics, nothing about culture, something that's extremely primary. Whereas what Now is doing is really almost the opposite. His work, I think, would be inconceivable without the disjunctions, as I said earlier, of postmodernism, but also the disjunctions that we experience now in our internet-dominated lives. The idea of something falling apart and rising up into form at the same time, which is perhaps a fitting metaphor or description of what digital experience is all about. And also specifically in his case, this idea of rethinking a medium in a very, very aggressive way. So being asked to make a moon jar, he makes two objects that are, first of all, not identical or symmetrical, as the moon jar might be expected to be, also with fissures, tears, rifts in the body of the clay, and also with this very unusual use of glaze, which is fired onto the surface in a kind of pillow, sort of laid on top, almost like a sheet. Like a pat of butter, you might say, and allowed to fuse onto the form rather than being sprayed or dipped in a traditional way. And then, of course, these rickety, uncertain, aggressive, almost violent-looking metal cages or plinths that he uses to support the works, which seem to me to be in some way in communication with the other plinths in the show, which of course are beautifully finished, and that nice celadon blue that colleagues here at the Fitzwilliam chose, and have a kind of wholeness and also a passivity to them that do not claim any attention for themselves, whereas what now Matsunaga has done is create these plinths that are every bit as sculptural as the pots they hold up. It's hard to say where the piece ends, sort of like Brancusi and his sculptures which flow down into their bases. So you have all of that going on in these very uncomfortable, intentionally uncomfortable and disruptive objects. So on the one hand, we have Akiko Harai looking back and saying, this is where our future perhaps lies. Certainly my future as an artist, she might say, lies in a continuing investigation of this single form and the gestures that might be made on its surface, the material incidents of that surface. And on the other hand, you have now Matsunaga suggesting that the future, at least again for him, lies in a kind of eclecticism and miscellaneousness and a sort of uneasy investigation and adventurousness. What about Claire Toomey's Made in China, work that we've mentioned a few times today already? What is the kind of vote that is made about the future of ceramics in Claire's case? Well, you know, one thing that I think I would say sharply distinguishes what Claire does from the other artists in the show, not only Akiko Hirai and now Matsunaga, but really all the other artists in the show, is that, first of all, she's not really a maker. She has things made, which is very different. She's in a directive role, almost like a film director or a choreographer or an orchestra conductor in relationship to the people that are making her works, not just in this project, but in all of her projects. But also, there's, in a way, a kind of underlying question of why does this even need to be ceramics? Because if she's not relying on a specific skill base, as the other people you've heard from today have, Halima and Allison, for example, then why couldn't she simply work in some other medium? Why couldn't she work in neon? Why couldn't she work in bubblegum? What is it about ceramics that keeps her coming back to it, given that she has this indirect methodology? And I think the answer is because she sees ceramics as an extremely sensitive register of labor as it exists today in light of the past. So if you like, her vote would not be so much her vote about how we should feel about this medium would not be so much hold your nerve as perhaps you should be unnerved, you should be concerned, you should be worried. This is an anxious work to me, one that suggests a lot about the asymmetry of production as it exists in China and in the UK. What people are paid in China and the UK is of great interest to her, and she wants a work that indexes that asymmetry and unfairness in the global economy. And also she wants a work that is going to interrupt the standard operating procedure of the place where it is displayed. So Vicky, you had said, what can museums do to directly engage in this narrative and this debate? Well, one thing that we can do is this sort of gesture, or maybe even more powerfully as you have it here at the Fitzwilliam amongst the permanent collection, where it not only makes you feel different in the space, but it also hopefully prompts you to think about the labor conditions that prevailed when all those other objects were made. What was it like to be a Meissen figure sculptor in the 18th century? What was it like to be the poor fellow who had to actually mix the clay in Jingdezhen at the beginning of that massive early industrial assembly line to get into these surpassingly beautiful porcelains that we have in the galleries? And I think what Claire is trying to do is excavate all of that uncertainty about how we should feel about the past and therefore how we might feel about the future. Perhaps we should experience ceramics not primarily as an aesthetic discipline, but instead as a political one, and one that has always been political in a way that our museums don't acknowledge very readily. And that's, of course, a very, very different proposition. And again, although in a different direction from Matsunaga, almost antithetical to the proposition that comes out of Akiko Hirai's work, which is, of course, entirely about aesthetics, entirely about the kind of visual and material pleasure of the discipline. What about Halima's work? We were just hearing about it on the panel just now. What kind of proposal is this about the future of ceramics? Well, here I would say, and this is one reason I wanted to ask you, Halima, about the experience that you had reaching out to a network of people to source the clays. Here we have, I think, a very optimistic proposal, and one that, again, seems to be very different from Claire Toomey's, even though it has some of the same hallmarks. So just as Made in China is a statement about the global conditions of ceramics, so too is Halima's. But what Halima is doing is isolating the specific conditions of each of these places from which the clay comes, and then I almost want to say paying tribute to each one of those places and the experiences and the pasts that inhere in those particular points on the globe. So whereas I think, at least again for me, what Made in China does is to imply a kind of fluidity and a slipperiness, almost a terrifying lack of fixity in the way that objects arise out of and give us information about the economy and the global world of exchange in which we all live. What Halima seems to be doing to me is giving you a whole series of objects that says, yes, you can know, yes, you can have a specific relationship to a specific place, and I can give you that feeling. I can give you an object that is not only from Cuba, but is also about Cuba, and does some justice to the beliefs, the history, the material ground of that place. And a series of those objects, again, repeated potentially infinitely. So two projects that in a way, for me, serve as the framing elements, the bookends of the exhibition, also seem to me to indicate very different directions about what should happen in ceramics in the future. So those are just a few examples from the show, and I dare say I probably could isolate any of the works made by any of the potters in our exhibition as giving you a similarly specific directional suggestion about where the field will go. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight about all the examples that I've given, and this slide I think gets that across really well, is that all of those suggestions are in fact personal. And the one thing that maybe everything in our show has in common is that it's meant as the expression of an individual point of view. Even the industrially fabricated objects in the show, of which there are very few in fact, like the Susie Cooper tea set, or the early Christopher Dresser pots, which of course are designed by somebody and made by somebody else, even those seem to express a very specific individual aesthetic. Christopher Dresser's general manner, his sensibility, and similarly with Susie Cooper in the interwar period. But perhaps when thinking about the future of studio pottery, or the future of ceramics as a whole, we need to admit that maybe it's not going to be individual artists and makers who are calling the shots. Maybe we need to think about larger structures which do not so easily fit, again, inside a museum logic of a work made by an artist for a certain reason with a certain result. Maybe we need to think about things like this, the Great Pottery Throwdown. In other words, pottery in the condition of our contemporary media culture, pottery in the condition of reality TV, which is almost a prospect so horrible that I don't want to spend any more time on it, but I'm going to anyway, because what we need to understand is that despite the fact that there is, at least in my view, an ongoing strength and vitality in the studio tradition, as defined perhaps simply as people making ceramics in a small-scale atelier fashion with full knowledge of the past of the medium. On the other hand, other aspects of culture, which may be much more powerful in terms of gaining people's attention, and let's not forget that we live in an attention economy where attention paid is often where value goes, like it or not. This is what most people in Britain perhaps would think about if you were to say, what did you last experience in terms of pottery? It would not be a Lucy Rhee. It would not be an exhibition of the Fitzwilliam. It would be a kind of tacky TV show. And that is the reality in which the future of the discipline in some way will be molded. More broadly, I think we can say that craft, not just ceramics, but craft as a totality is currently undergoing a transformation, which is fascinating, from something that was very marginal, very countercultural, as I talked about with Allison earlier, to something that is actually a dominant, I hesitate to say this, but dominant meme. In other words, a kind of thematic idea that's traveling through culture on the internet, on TV, and in other cultural channels. So you have a situation in which media outlets, companies, and even whole nations, governments, are seizing on craft and its current fashionability as a tool to promote their interests and gain profit, which is very destabilizing for those of us, myself included, who got into craft thinking of it as a kind of marginal activity that needed to be fought for. Now that you have TV production companies coming along and promoting it in a very different way, a way that's very much emphasizing baseline ideas about skill, competitiveness, certainly nothing to do with the artistic refinement that we've been talking about today, how do we react to that? Now, one way that we could see this going, perhaps, is in the direction of fine art. And this might be the most obvious direction. Again, here we are in a museum, one that's filled with great works of fine and decorative art. And we could say, well, perhaps what needs to happen here is that British ceramics, like other craft-associated media, need to get over themselves and just join the rest of the art world and all of the associated dynamics of the art world. And certainly we would have some pole stars to follow in that respect, some guidelines to follow. So here, for example, is the work of Rebecca Warren, often working in unfired clay that's then been painted. And I think very interesting to think about the status of an object like this one as opposed to, let's say, the work of Akiko Harai. Some of the same kinds of visual pleasure to be had from them, but really evolving from almost completely opposite points of view in terms of what ceramics should be or could be. Another example would be Andrew Lord, somebody who I think we curators probably would have been happy to have in the show, but he himself probably would not want to have been in the show because he's always resisted the idea of being drawn into the ceramic world, even though he makes objects that refer explicitly to functional vessel forms and of course has been working principally in clay for the majority of his career. In fact, he even refers to very specific, kind of geeky ceramic things like the habit of repairing a work with gold. It's called kintsugi, this well-known practice that occurs particularly in Japan in the tea ceremony context. So there's a kind of historical resistance there between artists who work in clay and don't want to be seen as this part of the studio pottery movement and the studio pottery movement itself, which has often sought to claim them. And we need only think about Grayson Perry as another example of this, the very nuanced description that Tanya gave earlier of Aaron Angel and the way that he's positioned himself as a fine artist who is sort of digging around in the archive of studio ceramics, and I think intentionally selecting figures like Gillian Lowndes or Mo Jup, who are not well known by people in the ceramics world and seem to have been perhaps unfairly treated by those of us who have been gatekeepers in this discipline. We've been talking about Lucy Rhee, Hans Koper, Bernard Leach, so he goes and finds Mo Jup and Gillian Lowndes almost as a way of laying claim to a kind of avant-garde credential. So you have this, as I say, this kind of tussle between what happens in the fine art context and what happens in the studio pottery context. If I had a guess, I would say that that probably will continue, but that it won't be much of an issue as far as ceramics as a discipline goes, for the simple reason that fine art is actually completely indifferent to the material that it's made from, typically. So although those of us who are in the ceramic world tend to find it fascinating that there's a certain tendency to adopt clay or fiber in the art world is not really built to have constituencies that are based on medium. So although we might find that there are many artists working with ceramics, with clay, fired and unfired, I think it's unlikely that the center of energy, if you like, the gravitational center of ceramics will in any way be in the art world, because the art world doesn't care. The art world doesn't hold any brief for any particular material. That would be a little bit like the Bazooka Bubblegum Company hoping that the fine art world was going to change the public perception of bubblegum by having a bunch of artists who make things out of bubblegum. And a few artists, in fact, do make things out of bubblegum. Tom Friedman is one that comes to mind. But there isn't a bubblegum constituency. And there's not going to be one in ceramics either, in fine art, unless something very, very surprising happens to the nature of fine art. And in fact, in my view, ever since Duchamp, there's been a real fork in the road with people in the craft world wanting to see their particular media of choice upheld as significant by the art world, and the art world saying in so many words, well, we don't think in that way any longer. We don't think in terms of medium. Otherwise, Duchamp's urinal would be understood as a ceramic object, which of course it's not. It's understood as a ready-made or conceptual artwork. And that fork in the road, I think, is unlikely ever to converge again. So again, for what it's worth, my prediction is that although we might look to the fine art world as the place where studio ceramics, energy, and legacy will come to reside, I think that's very unlikely indeed. What about technology? This is another obvious possibility, albeit one that hasn't been explored that much simply for technical limitations. And here I'm showing you the work of another artist who actually went through the RCA, got his practice-based PhD there a few years ago, and this is Michael Eden, who is one of the few people here in the UK or really anywhere who's working effectively with 3D printing technology in a ceramic context. Not only using ceramics, by the way, he also prints with other materials, but I'm showing you here a couple of examples of his work in this medium. Often, again, interestingly, I think, specifically relating back to the history of the medium. So he often looks back to the designs of Wedgwood and other neoclassical ceramics in his work. And here is another object which is here in the Fitzwilliam collection, just added and is on display, as you might have seen downstairs. stairs, right by some of Claire's red vases. And this is, I think, a really wonderful example of how somebody who is trained as a potter will encounter a new technology and imagine it from his point of view, because what you get here is this wonderful centrifugal whirlwind of lines that, to me, again, this is a little bit fanciful, but to me, only somebody who knows how to throw would think of doing this, because it's exactly that kind of dynamic, that set of forces that he will have been thinking about his whole life as he's been dragging his fingers up and down the wall of a vessel as it's rising up from the surface of the wheel. And to me, this is so much like the way that Keith Murray, the great designer for Wedgwood, imagined his own process of making industrial wares with those great concentric rings in the tea set that you see upstairs. It's a kind of update about a century later of the same idea. How can we use a new technology to engage with the formal structures that have always been present in handmade pottery? However, again, I think it's extremely unlikely that the natural home for studio pottery is ever going to be advanced technology. And I guess as evidence for this, I would first adduce the fact that Michael Eden is probably the only person working in a really successful way in terms of 3D manufacture of these objects so far, which doesn't exactly look to me like a groundswell. But also, I think that there's something about the way that ceramics, at least in the studio pottery context, has always been incredibly analog, incredibly palpable, sensual, and physical. And when you read the writings of so many people who have been involved in the field over the past century, what they will go back to again and again, and you heard it from Halima and Allison earlier today, is the immediacy of the clay, the way it feels in the fingers, the different states that it passes through in the studio. The kind of magic of that material is simply not something that can be translated into an indirect, technologically mediated context like a 3D printer. Of course, you can use a 3D printer to print ceramic, just as you can metal, nylon, other plastics, resins. But I think it's very unlikely that satisfactions that we have derived from studio pottery are ever going to be derived from that kind of technologically mediated infrastructure and tooling. I just don't see that happening. And in fact, I think, if anything, that the advent of new technologies, whether it's 3D printing and CNC routers, or it's the more consumer-based technologies of YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and the internet at large, if anything, that's driving people away from technology into a more direct, hands-on relationship to materials. At least that's what I'm seeing in a lot of art school contexts and people who are, let's say, in their 20s and 30s, a kind of aggressive investment in the analog. So although I think that technology will be an interesting kind of sideline, sort of nipping at the edges of what's happening in ceramics, I don't think that it's going to be the natural home for the energies of this discipline. How about the factory? So Tanya gave an unimprovable lecture this morning, which in part dealt with this theme, the question of whether the factory might finally come back into concert with handmaking as a natural home, again, for this discipline. And as Tanya said, this is a long and fraught story, just as long and fraught as the relationship between ceramics and fine art sculpture. And here I'm showing you a couple of images of project that Tanya already showed, which was Neil Brownsword's incredible collaboration with Rita Floyd, who is an experienced flower maker from Stoke-on-Trent. And you know, there is something I think just surpassingly beautiful about this project, because of the way that Neil and Rita together were able to stage this experience of ephemerality, something that had been so neglected as to be really invisible even to the people that were purchasing the work. In other words, as Rita Floyd has been making these daisies one after another, roses one after another, nasturtiums, whatever she's making, and putting them on these vessels, the people that were then buying those objects had very little sense that these even were handmade, much less how that would have been done or who would have been doing it. And so this intercession, this intervention that Neil Brownsword made to actually put Rita's craftsmanship on display and draw attention to it in a demonstrative, performative way, so turning it into a kind of piece of theater and allowing people to meet Rita, talk to her about her experiences, really transform something that had been neglected and thrown away by the larger society and the economy into something that was accorded the respect with which that it was due. I think, having said that, the sad truth is that the overall factory context is so inimical to the purposes of individual creativity that I think this is unfortunately always going to be a critical practice rather than one that actually enters the mainstream of manufacture. It reminds me of a book that I read recently by Joshua Freeman, maybe some of you have seen it, which is called Behemoth, which is about the history of the huge factory. It's not a history of factories, it's a history of the huge factory. And it starts, as you would expect, here in Britain in the 18th century and progresses through a long story, America in the 19th century, the Soviet Union, finally China today. And one of the things that Freeman demonstrates really amazingly well is that the factory tends to chew up and destroy its own reason for being and its own ability to survive in any one location. So it's sort of like a plague of locusts. This is my metaphor, not his, but it's like a plague of locusts that has to move constantly because it entirely digests the resources that it needs in any one location. And that's why the history of the factory is a history of itinerant transit from one economy to another. And I think that unfortunately what the factory is always going to do is leave a wake of distress behind it. That's just what factories do, and ceramics can't affect that. And whether factories will leave China in 10 years and go to Africa or South America is a little bit hard to predict, but one thing we can say is that the big factory is going to be with us, and it's not going to be a driver of humanist creativity, unfortunately. It is interesting to note that in addition to these projects that are about the ephemerality of ceramic and in some way deal with the kind of poignancy of that narrative, and here I'm showing you another example, which is this beautiful fountain that Phoebe Cummings made, which was displayed at the V&A in a show that in fact Alan curated in conjunction with the Crafts Council and the BBC Women's Hour, and some of you may have seen this. This is the piece when it was first made, again by hand using flower making skills just like the ones that Rita Floyd uses. And then Phoebe had water coming out of the top of this so that it slowly disintegrated. So another image rather like Neil Brownsword's of skill being sort of thrown to the winds, sort of dust thrown into the air. So as much as we have a kind of narrative of this poignant loss and the experience of loss coming out of neo-factory production, sorry, that's just a detail of it, which I hope you can see, as it's being degraded by the water. There are also more positive proposals as to how ceramics can be used in a productive context. And this, I think, actually is a really promising direction for the field, despite the fact that this is coming from kind of a totally different direction of travel. So this is the work of Assemble, who you may know because of their recognition recently from the Turner Prize Committee. And they were nominated not only for their architectural projects in Liverpool and elsewhere, and in fact this is a large group of makers who are all trained as architects, but also their ceramics. And so this is a series that they make that's created with a ram press, a historic kind of factory remnant. So again, some of the same ideas here that you see operating in Neil Brownsword's work. How can we use the leftover capabilities of the factory in the present day? And what they do with it is basically smash it. It's called splatware. And they make these very beautiful ceramics out of them, out of this process. And you can almost feel the impact of the ram press against the clay. Here's another shot of this. So this is a result or an approach that's often been called mass customization. And really what's being sought here is a kind of mid-ground between ceramics as an individual practice and ceramics as a mass production discipline. So this is sort of mass production, it's quasi mass production, but it produces a unique result every time, and it even has some of that trace of expressionism, some of that trace of gesture that we might associate with, let's say, Alison's work. And you think about the way that Alison paints her work and creates these incidents on the surface, and as she said, sometimes working from the slab, which already has marks in it, and then folding or building out of that. And there's something of this preserved in this much simpler approach that Assemble is taking. And this sort of leads me to my conclusion, which is that I think that what's going to happen, whether you like this answer or not, is that the future of ceramics is going to be kind of what the past of ceramics has been, which is to say something that's contingent, antithetical, and fundamentally always feeling a bit unhappy about where things are. So when I asked earlier, Allison, when I asked whether you thought ceramics was most effective as a countercultural practice, you said, well, that would be nice, because I suppose that would imply that it has a purpose, and a kind of idealist purpose as well. I can see that in a narrow sense, that's probably not true. I don't think that hippie potters are going to come along and save all of us and, rescue us from IKEA and Tupperware. That's not the narrative that I'm trying to put down. However, I think that because of ceramics' very multiplicity, it's always going to offer options that are themselves oppositional and antithetical to one another. So you'll notice that at the beginning of the talk, I began by saying that several of the potters that we included, Akiko Harai, now Matsunaga, Halima, etc., Claire Toomey, were offering different, juxtaposing, mutually incommensurate ideas of what ceramics would be in the present. In other words, although the show looks great, these are actually people who don't agree with one another, and they haven't. They didn't agree with each other in the 1900s, they didn't agree with each other in the 1930s, certainly not in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, and not today either. There's perhaps gentler forms of disagreement, but what we have fundamentally is multiplicity. And we have objects that arise out of this situation that for many people will seem exciting, and for others will seem absolutely horrific. We have, for example, Lee Broom's designs for Wedgwood, which have this kind of neo-postmodern, too bad you missed the 80s, but here it is again kind of sensibility, and really look much better on the cover of a magazine than they do in person, and in fact are exactly designed that way, just like a lot of design in the 1980s was designed to look good on the cover of a magazine, because that's what drives traffic, attention, and sales. But from a sort of conventional studio pottery point of view, probably is rather unsatisfying. I don't think you're going to see Lee Broom's vases entering the John Driscoll collection anytime soon. We also have, by the way, despite the fact that they are made by hand at Wedgwood and are upholding some of the same skills that Neil Brown sort of is trying to pay tribute to be fair. We also have what I would consider to be completely inadequate gestures in the direction of the value of pottery that do nothing for pottery itself, like this company that I found, which is called Shoes Like Pottery. And it's a Japanese company that has nothing to do with pottery. They're only a shoe manufacturer. But they're drawing on the legacy of Japanese ceramics as a way to lay claim to value for their shoes. So effectively what they're saying, and if you go online and watch some of their promotional videos, you'll see this. What they're saying is, we make shoes like the great Japanese potters made pots, one at a time, with great attention to materiality and form and aesthetic sensibility, which is obviously complete rubbish, and this is just advertising. It reminds me of a commercial that I saw a few years ago on TV that was for the Jeep Wagoneer, the new Jeep Wagoneer, and it started with images of blacksmiths hammering at an anvil, and then they cut to a Jeep Wagoneer cruising over the road through a forest as if the car was somehow made by hand by blacksmiths. It's that kind of fraudulent claim that's being made for the values of ceramics here in a totally different context. And it's fascinating to note that Shoes Like Pottery is actually being sold at Sunspell, the British brand with stores in London and elsewhere, who have also recently collaborated with Leach Pottery to make this rather nice tableware, actually. It's this image that I'm going to close with, because I think it so beautifully captures the level of discomfort and optimism that we so often find wrapped up in this medium. So on the one hand, we can say, would you rather have a piece that Leach made in the 1930s or even the 1950s standardware that we have upstairs on view in the exhibition, or would you rather have this, which is, beautifully made, in some ways respects the tradition. It alludes to the history of ceramics with its blue and white palette, just like the blue and white Chinese porcelains that you'll see here in the Fitz's permanent collection galleries. So yes, there is a kind of intelligence at work here, yet on the other hand, is this really the Leach pottery that we know and love? Is this the answer? And the answer, of course, is, well, kinda. Ceramics is just like anything else. It's just a material, and things happen in ceramics as they happen in any material, in bubble gum, in painting, in aluminum, in concrete. Although we all feel great affection for this medium, we have a lot of knowledge about it, at the end of the day, it is just a material. And to me, the idea of being in favor of it, per se, or thinking that as a material it is going to itself provide a solution, rather than a multiplicity of different dynamics, dialectical oppositions, is probably unrealistic. So I think that the future of ceramics is likely to be both individual and mass-produced, is likely to be both deeply immoral and exploitative and also liberatory and creative. I think it's likely to be both technological and traditional. In other words, I think it's likely to offer us the best and worst that humanity has to give. It has always done that, and I think it probably always will, and that probably is the best reason, ladies and gentlemen, that we should be interested in the first place. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Well, we were expecting fireworks from Glenn. Glenn always delivers the most provocative, thought-provoking, challenging, optimistic, depressing, amazing food for thought. We are slightly short of time, but I'm very, very keen to take a few last questions from the floor. So Helen's got the microphone. We've got a few minutes, so please do take this opportunity to question Glenn, who I think has looked into his crystal ball long and hard. And I actually think that you have a very, very good grip on actually the direction of travel and what we may be seeing in the next few decades. So please, yes.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Thank you so much. That was truly brilliant. I'm wondering, what it made me think about is all of these other industries, everything, the printing industry, the music industry, the design fabrics, dresses. Every industry is going through sort of something like this. Who are we? What are we going to do? Whether it's because of technology, where entire industries have been decimated, they don't exist anymore. We don't have Blockbuster. We don't have post-production houses for movies. All of those things are happening. And it is so thought-provoking for you to bring this up in this industry. And the story actually is different, which is what you sort of laid out. It's not like, you know, we're talking about post-production. It doesn't exist. You do everything on your computer. Printing, you know, which had big Heidelberg presses, and now everything is digital. So I'm wondering, when you look at this, which is such a huge topic, and this idea of, we were just talking about, what do you call yourself? Are you a studio potter? Are you an artist? What are you? How, what, and why in ceramics did this sense of the material become so important that you're talking about the material, not about the ideas? And I personally know that I've been having this discussion, not continually, thank goodness, but since 1972, and been on, you know, because I was always straddling both of these worlds. And so if you, I'm sorry this is so long, but if you take this other kinds of industries which have a very defined arc, which are kind of, that arc is going down. You know, if we stop talking about the material of clay, then what happens?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it maybe gives me a chance to clarify a couple of things. So one is that you're absolutely right to point to the fact that this is one of many declining industries that have the same shape, that shape. And you know, it would be foolish not to acknowledge the impact that that's had on our political life recently. So Brexit and the Trump election is what people always think of in this context, and that's right. You know, whatever you think of them, it's hard to deny that they're not both symptomatic of a certain sense of panic around traditionally based industries. You know, we could say, well, actually those industries have only been in their current healthy state for a relatively short time, maybe less than half a century in most cases, but that doesn't make it any less painful, and I think it's good to recognize that. So that's maybe one point of clarification. And the other point is to say that I hope that I'm not coming across as so relativistic that it sounds like I'm not for anything. So I think it's not a good idea to be a champion for a material, because again, that's why I always talk about bubblegum. Like, can you imagine being like the head of the bubblegum council, right? In a way, being the head of a ceramics organization or even the Crafts Council is more analogous to that than we would like to admit, perhaps, except for one really crucial thing, which is that the values of individualism, creativity, and freedom, which is a big word, but I think a totally appropriate one, have always been embedded in the history of this material. And yes, it happens to be clay as opposed to bubble gum, but I think you can simultaneously say, listen, the material itself is not the answer, and it's not ever going to provide this homogeneous solution to our problems, or even a safe place of rest, in the way that perhaps Leach thought it would. But it is simultaneously possible to say, but then look, you have people like Halima, you have people like Alison, you have people like Nao and Claire and Akiko. Look how different they are. Look how wonderful all of them are. And by God, let's support them, which is what museums are for. So I think it's possible to hold both of those ideas in your head at the same time.
It's fascinating and complicated, and thank you for laying all of that out in all its dimensionality.
Thank you. By the way, everyone, that's Marilyn Dinton-Fass, who is married to John Driscoll and is a wonderful potter and former potter and painter more than anything in her own right. So thank you very much, Marilyn.
I don't think I was a potter.
Ceramic artist, let's say. You can discuss that with Alison. Hey, Alan.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for a really thought-provoking presentation, and thank you to all the curators for, I think, a really wonderful and thought-provoking exhibition. I think one of the most interesting things, in a sense, about the exhibition, and kind of perhaps surprising things about the exhibition, is that it's been framed essentially around the vessel form, and it's called British Studio Pottery. That's in the title. But then a couple of the works that you mentioned as pointing kind of ways forward, and a couple of the works that I definitely think point the way forward, those of Halima and also now Matsunaga, tangentially reference the vessel, but they don't trouble themselves with that category too much. And I suppose my question really is, is the studio pottery movement, does that have a future? Is there a separate kind of trajectory that will, interrogate the vessel, or has that gone now? Have we moved beyond that?
Yeah, so maybe there's one sort of question lurking inside there, which is why the focus on the vessel in the show, and then the second question would be, is that important going to the future? Super fair question. I guess, Martina spoke a little bit about this earlier, but I think one reason that we wanted to focus on the vessel was because of the narratives about centering and grounding and a kind of axial orientation within the universe that have often been claimed for it, which is quite specific. And also, as it happens, those of you who have been to the Yale Center for British Art know that that building is a great place to put vessels on show, partly because they just look so good, but also because it has this wonderful cylindrical stare and a sense of containment and encompassing monumentality that's quite powerful. So that's not so relevant here at the Fitzwilliam, but certainly in terms of an architectural response as curators, we thought that was significant. But as I say, there was also this idea of a kind of centering gesture. M.C. Richards, the poet, wrote about this so beautifully in an American context. And for my money, you will continue to see that as an indispensable point of reference. I don't think that you'll get into a situation where the vessel feels indistinguishable from things like what Phoebe Cummings is doing, for example, or Neil Brownsword's flower making practice and with Rita Floyd. I think that the vessel is sort of like clay itself. It's something that's too much part of the furniture of our psychology. It's something so ancient and so ever present as well. So I do think that point I made at the beginning, that you tend to start your days with a vessel and maybe you end up, cremated and buried in one as well, or you end up live the rest of your days on a mantelpiece. There's reasons that people do that. And I don't think that's going anywhere. But again, I would just say that it's to caution against thinking of that as some kind of true anchor that has its own kind of ethical superiority. I just think it's like any other geometrical figure. It gives you a way of organizing your thoughts, but that doesn't necessarily mean your thoughts will be any better or more coherent. Kind of like a painting is flat, by the way, if you think about it, and kind of rectangular. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, John Driscoll has a question. I think we better end with him. Yeah, please.
I've never used the term vessel myself, I don't think, but one of the things that's always struck me about ceramics, and even a lot of sculptural ceramics, is the presence of the void, which you don't get in a lot of other forms of expression. And I wonder if you would want to comment on the void as part of the future.
Yeah. So not to get too pretentious about this, but Heidegger wrote an essay called The Thing, which potters love, about how when a potter is shaping clay, what they're actually doing is shaping the negative space inside the clay, which some potters agree with that and some don't, and it probably depends on the pot. It's not something Heidegger was so attuned to. But I certainly think that this idea of the unrevealed and the withheld is really powerful. So that point I made earlier in passing during the conversation with Alison and Halima about the difference between the back of a painting, which is kind of like, who cares, it's just the canvas and some labels, as opposed to the inside of the pot, which is both a place that the potter has had their hand or arm, and it has this kind of incredible intimacy, almost like a bodily cavity, and has been worked and considered in that way, but also which remains, particularly any vase-like form or really contained form, which remains a place that one needs to, in a funny way, be given permission to enter or special access to enter. I think that's a fundamental dynamic of pots, and I agree, I prefer calling them pots really, that you don't get in other disciplines, and one that, maybe I'll just end with this because I just thought it was such a great thing that Alison said earlier, that a pot is in a way a metaphor for a person, not in the sense that it has a neck and a body and a foot, which is true, but also in the sense that it has an inside and a face that it presents to the world, and all of us can identify with that. And that ultimately mysterious relationship between your own psychology and the way that you come across to other people and the way that a pot has an inside and an outside, those things do seem the same to me in some ineffable way, and that's probably another reason why we love these things so much. Okay, thank you very much.